"That's the maid," my daughter-in-law said at the checkout counter, and she didn't even lower her voice. The cashier had just smiled at us and asked, "Is this your mom?" And for half a second I thought Lauren would laugh and say, "Yes, of course, this is Margaret, Daniel's mother, the grandmother of my children." Instead she adjusted her sunglasses on top of her perfectly styled blonde hair, gave a small amused shake of her head, and answered as if she were clarifying something trivial, something obvious. "Oh no. That's the maid." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed softly and stayed there like a stain you can't quite wipe away. I kept both hands on the handle of the shopping cart. The metal felt cold against my palms, even though it was late July, and the parking lot outside shimmered in 90-degree heat. We were at the big grocery store off Route 17. The one with the polished floors and wide aisles where everything smells faintly of citrus cleaner and fresh bread. I had come along because Lauren said she could use help with the kids and because I still believed that being useful was the same thing as being wanted. Daniel was a few feet away, comparing cereal boxes, pretending to study sugar content as if the decision required deep concentration. He heard her. I know he did. The cashier's smile faltered for just a second before she scanned the rotisserie chicken I had picked out, the one Daniel likes, the one I used to make from scratch every Sunday when he was little and our house in Cedar Grove was still loud with Legos and cartoons. I told myself not to react. Not there. Not in front of strangers standing in line with their reusable bags and polite expressions. I straightened my shoulders and reached for my purse to pay for the groceries, the same way I had paid countless times before when Lauren would sigh about how expensive everything had become. "You don't have to," she had said once or twice in the past, but she never actually stopped me. Today she didn't even look in my direction. She was busy checking her phone, her diamond wedding band catching the fluorescent lights. I watched my reflection in the small security mirror above the register. 72 years old. Silver hair pulled back neatly. A pale blue cardigan even though the air conditioning was set too high, as always. I didn't look like a maid. I looked like someone's mother. Someone's grandmother. I looked like the woman who co-signed Daniel's first car loan and stayed up all night when he had the flu at 8 years old, holding a cool washcloth to his forehead. But in that aisle, in that moment, I was reduced to a role Lauren could shrug into and out of whenever it suited her. The receipt printed with a long mechanical sigh. I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet. No one corrected her. Not the cashier. Not the woman behind us with the toddler in the cart. Especially not my son. And as we walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, pushing a cart full of groceries I had paid for, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. Humiliation doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes in a casual sentence delivered with a smile, while everyone else pretends it's perfectly normal. I did not say anything in the parking lot. I did not confront her, and I did not look at Daniel to see whether guilt had found its way onto his face. I simply helped load the groceries into the back of their sport utility vehicle, placing the paper bags carefully so the eggs would not crack and the peaches would not bruise. The asphalt shimmered under the afternoon sun, and the heat pressed against my skin in thick waves, but inside the car the air conditioning hummed steadily, cold and impersonal. Lauren slid into the front passenger seat and began scrolling through her phone again. Her expression relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened. The children argued softly in the back over a tablet, their voices blending into the white noise of traffic as Daniel merged onto the highway. I sat in the third row, hands folded in my lap, watching the familiar exit signs pass by. The same roads I used to drive when Daniel was learning to read the green overhead markers out loud. Back then he would clap when he recognized our street. Back then he would reach for my hand at stoplights. I thought about that small boy and wondered at what point the distance had begun. It had not happened all at once. It never does. It was a gradual shift, like furniture being moved an inch at a time until the room no longer feels the same. After his father passed away 3 years ago, I tried to be careful. I tried not to interfere, not to give advice unless I was asked. I sold the old sedan and moved into a smaller townhouse 20 minutes away, so I would not be in their space too often. Lauren had thanked me for understanding. She had said it would be easier that way. Easier for whom I never asked. When we arrived at their house, the one Daniel and I had chosen together when it was just a patch of grass and a wooden sign that read "Coming soon," I carried the lighter bags inside without waiting to be told. I knew where everything went. I always did. The pantry shelves were labeled in Lauren's tidy handwriting, but I remembered the layout from the countless afternoons I had spent babysitting, chopping vegetables, wiping counters, making myself useful. That word echoed now in my mind. Useful. It is a quiet kind of currency. You offer your time, your money, your energy, hoping it will translate into belonging. I placed the milk on the top shelf of the refrigerator and lined up the canned soup labels so they faced forward. No one asked me to. No one thanked me either. Lauren stood at the kitchen island recounting the story of the store to a friend on speakerphone, her tone light, almost playful. "You should have seen the cashier's face," she said with a small laugh. I kept my back turned. I did not need to hear the rest. Daniel walked past me with the final bag and paused for a second, as if he might say something, as if the words were forming somewhere behind his teeth. Then he cleared his throat and asked if I could stay a little longer to watch the children while they ran an errand. I nodded. Of course I nodded. That is what I have always done. But as I stood alone in the kitchen a few minutes later, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, I realized something had shifted again. Not in the furniture. Not in the house. In me. I had spent years trying to earn a place that was supposed to be mine from the beginning. And for the first time I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped trying. That afternoon stretched longer than it should have. After Daniel and Lauren left for their errand, the house settled into a careful silence, the kind that feels organized and controlled. The children sat at the dining table with their coloring books, their small voices rising and falling in ordinary arguments about crayons, and whose turn it was to choose the next cartoon. I moved through the kitchen slowly, wiping the already clean countertop with a damp cloth, rinsing out the sink, folding a dish towel that did not need folding. I have always believed that you can tell how a woman sees herself by how she moves inside someone else's home. I moved as if I were temporary. I moved as if I had to earn every step. The word echoed again in my mind, quieter now but sharper. Maid. It is a simple word. It describes honest work. There is dignity in it when chosen, but it becomes something else when assigned to erase you. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window overlooking the backyard. The lawn was trimmed neatly, the patio furniture arranged just so. I remembered when this yard was nothing but uneven dirt and Daniel had asked me whether the maple tree should go on the left or the right side of the fence. We had planted it together, kneeling in the grass, our hands covered in soil. He had thanked me then. He used to thank me for everything. When the children asked for a snack, I prepared apple slices and peanut butter, cutting the fruit into even wedges the way I did when Daniel was their age. The little one smiled up at me and said, "Thank you, Grandma." The word landed differently. It was soft and uncomplicated. I realized that children do not edit their affection to match the mood of the room. They give it freely until someone teaches them otherwise. I wondered what they had been taught. As the afternoon light shifted across the hardwood floors, I sat down at the kitchen table and allowed myself to replay the moment at the store without flinching. The cashier's polite confusion, the quickness of Lauren's response, the way Daniel had remained silent, as if neutrality were the safest position. Silence can be louder than cruelty. It signals agreement without requiring courage. I tried to remember when Lauren stopped calling me Mom. At first it had been Margaret, said with a friendly tone. Then it became nothing at all, sentences shaped carefully to avoid any title. I had told myself it was modern that younger women preferred first names. I had told myself not to be sensitive. But there is a difference between modern and dismissive. One adapts. The other erases. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where framed family photos lined the wall. Vacations at the lake. Christmas mornings in matching pajamas. My husband's last birthday before the illness took him quietly in his sleep. In each picture I stood close to Daniel. In the newer ones I noticed a subtle shift. I was at the edge. Still present. Less central. It had happened gradually, politely, almost kindly. And perhaps that was why I had allowed it. When Daniel and Lauren returned, laughing about something that had nothing to do with me, I greeted them with the same steady tone I always used. I did not mention the store. I did not demand an explanation. Instead, I gathered my purse and said I should head home before traffic thickened on the interstate. Daniel offered a brief hug, distracted but not unkind. Lauren thanked me for helping, her smile perfectly arranged. As I stepped out into the cooling evening air, I felt the faintest sense of clarity settle over me. I could continue to be useful. I could continue to be quiet. Or I could begin quietly to redefine the role I was willing to play. And for the first time the choice did not feel impossible. That night, after I returned to my townhouse, I did not turn on the television. I did not pour a glass of wine or call a friend to recount what had happened. I placed my purse on the small oak table by the door, slipped off my shoes and walked slowly through the quiet rooms. The air felt different there, lighter somehow, as if the walls were not waiting for me to justify my presence. I paused in front of the framed photograph of my husband that sits on the mantel, his smile steady and familiar. He had always believed that respect inside a family was not negotiable. People show you who you are to them, he used to say, not in grand speeches but in small careless moments. I had dismissed that wisdom more than once, telling myself that love required patience, that younger generations spoke differently, behaved differently, valued independence over formality. But as I stood in the dim light of the living room, I could no longer pretend that the moment at the store was careless. It was intentional. Casual but intentional. I sank into the armchair by the window and allowed the silence to expand around me. The maple tree outside swayed gently in the warm evening breeze, and I remembered planting its twin in Daniel's yard years ago. Back then, he had asked for my opinion about everything. Mortgage rates, paint colors, the best way to insulate the attic before winter. When Lauren came into his life, I welcomed her. I set an extra place at the table. I gave her my mother's china for their first Thanksgiving as a married couple. I told her she could call me Mom if she wished, or Margaret if that felt more comfortable. I thought giving her options was kindness. I did not realize it might also be permission to distance me. Over time, small changes accumulated. Holiday plans were discussed after decisions had already been made. Family photographs were taken without calling me into the frame until the last minute. Invitations arrived as text messages instead of phone calls. Each instance was minor on its own, easy to explain away. I explained them all. I became skilled at that. Skilled at minimizing my own discomfort so that everyone else could remain at ease. But sitting there alone, I understood something I had resisted for years. When you continually accept a smaller space, people begin to assume that is the size you prefer. I walked into my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser where important papers were neatly organized in labeled folders. Insurance documents, property deeds, bank statements, practical things. I ran my fingers over the envelope containing the deed to Daniel's house. My name was still on it. Not because I insisted, but because when he first qualified for the loan, my credit history and savings had strengthened his application. I had never asked to be removed. I had trusted that family meant permanence. Lauren often spoke as if the house were entirely theirs, as if I had simply helped in the beginning and then stepped aside. Perhaps she believed that to be true. Perhaps Daniel did as well. I closed the drawer carefully. I was not interested in revenge. I was not interested in confrontation for its own sake. But I was interested in clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. Respect, I realized, is not restored by pleading for it. It is restored by adjusting what you are willing to give. The next time I was invited to help with groceries or babysitting or holiday preparations, I would pause before answering. I would consider whether my presence was valued or merely convenient. For years I had equated sacrifice with love. That evening, in the stillness of my own home, I began to understand that love without dignity slowly erodes both. And erosion once noticed cannot be unseen. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun organizing itself around a decision. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains in soft stripes across the bedroom wall, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a lawnmower starting up somewhere down the block. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary day. Yet something inside me felt rearranged. I made coffee the way I always do, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring the water slowly, waiting for the familiar scent to fill the kitchen. Routine has a way of calming the body, even when the heart is unsettled. I carried my mug to the small dining table and opened my planner. It was an old habit from years of managing a household budget, appointments, school schedules. I wrote down one simple item for the day. Call Mr. Henderson. He had been our attorney for more than 20 years, first for a will, then for property matters, later for small adjustments after my husband passed away. I had not spoken to him in months. There had been no need. Or perhaps I had convinced myself there was no need. By mid-morning I dialed his office number. My voice sounded steady, almost casual, when I asked for an appointment to review some documents. The receptionist offered me a slot for Thursday at 10:30 in the morning. I accepted without hesitation. After hanging up I did not feel dramatic or defiant. I felt practical, clear. That clarity surprised me more than anger would have. I spent the afternoon gathering papers from the dresser drawer and placing them neatly into a leather folder. The deed to Daniel's house, copies of the mortgage agreement, bank statements showing the transfer I had made years ago to cover the down payment. I remembered that day vividly. Daniel had been anxious, pacing the living room, worried that the lender would not approve him on his own. I had told him family means stepping in when needed. I had not imagined that stepping in would someday make me invisible. As I sorted through the documents, I found an old birthday card Daniel had written me when he was 12. The handwriting was uneven, the ink slightly faded. "Thank you for always being there, Mom." I smiled at that. Not because it erased anything, but because it reminded me that love had once been uncomplicated. I placed the card back in the drawer and closed it gently. Later that evening, Lauren sent a text message asking whether I could watch the children on Saturday, because she and Daniel had a dinner reservation downtown. I read the message twice before responding. In the past I would have replied immediately with enthusiasm. This time I waited an hour. Then I wrote, "I am not available this weekend." The words felt strange at first, almost foreign, but they did not feel wrong. There was a pause before her reply came through. "Oh, okay. We will figure something out." No apology. No acknowledgement of the other day. Just logistics. I set my phone down and looked around my quiet townhouse. For years I believed that maintaining harmony required my constant participation. Now I began to understand that harmony built on imbalance is fragile by design. I was not planning a confrontation. I was planning a correction. And corrections, when handled calmly, do not require raised voices. They require boundaries. As night settled over the neighborhood and the streetlights flickered on one by one, I felt something settle inside me as well. I could not control how Lauren chose to introduce me. I could not force Daniel to speak up. But I could decide what my name, my time, and my resources were worth. And that decision, unlike the moment at the store, would not be made in passing. It would be made deliberately, with full awareness of what I was reclaiming. Thursday morning arrived with a pale blue sky and the faint scent of freshly cut grass drifting through my open window. I dressed carefully, not formally, but with intention. A cream blouse, navy slacks, low heels polished the night before. I brushed my silver hair back and fastened the small pearl earrings my husband gave me on our 30th anniversary. They were not extravagant, but they reminded me of who I had been long before anyone reduced me to a convenience. Mr. Henderson's office sat in a modest brick building near downtown, across from a bakery that always smelled of warm sugar and coffee. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the reception area, listening to the quiet ticking of a wall clock and the low murmur of voices behind closed doors. When he greeted me, his expression was warm, familiar. He had aged since I last saw him, more gray at his temples, but his handshake was steady. We sat across from one another at a large oak desk, and I placed the leather folder between us without drama. I explained, calmly and without bitterness, that I wished to review my financial ties and property arrangements. He listened carefully, asking practical questions. Did I intend to remain on the deed of Daniel's home? Was I comfortable with the current structure of my will? Had there been any changes in family dynamics I wished to consider? I answered honestly. Yes, there had been changes. Subtle ones. Significant ones. I told him I wanted clarity, not conflict. I wanted my assets structured in a way that reflected respect, not assumption. He nodded as if he understood more than I had said aloud. We reviewed the documents line by line. My name was indeed still on the deed. My contribution to the down payment was documented. There were options, he explained. I could remain as co-owner. I could request formal recognition of my financial stake. I could establish a trust that outlined specific conditions for future inheritance. None of these choices required confrontation. They required intention. I left his office with a revised plan drafted and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. The air outside felt different against my skin, cooler somehow, though the temperature had climbed into the mid-80s. I walked slowly to my car, aware of a quiet steadiness inside me. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His voice carried a hint of confusion. Lauren had mentioned that I declined to babysit. He asked whether everything was all right. I answered simply, "Everything is fine. I have just decided to be more mindful of my time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he were recalibrating his expectations. He said he understood, though he did not sound entirely certain. After we hung up, I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. In the past, I would have rushed to reassure him, to smooth over any discomfort. This time I allowed the space to remain. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner for myself, grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, I noticed how peaceful my kitchen felt without the quiet pressure of proving my usefulness. Respect cannot be demanded into existence, but it can be reinforced through action. I was no longer willing to participate in a version of family where my presence was conditional. The correction had begun, not with raised voices or sharp words, but with measured steps taken in daylight, documented and deliberate. And for the first time in a long while, I felt certain that I was no longer shrinking to fit someone else's convenience. The following week unfolded quietly, but not without tension. I did not initiate contact and I did not withdraw completely. I maintained a steady rhythm, like someone adjusting the volume, rather than turning the music off entirely. On Sunday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He stood at my doorway holding a box of pastries from the bakery near his house, the same one that sells the lemon tarts I like. The gesture was familiar, almost rehearsed. When he stepped inside, he glanced around as if searching for signs that something dramatic had taken place. Nothing had. The furniture remained in its place. The framed photographs still lined the hallway. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser I keep near the window. He cleared his throat and sat at the dining table while I poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. For a moment we spoke about ordinary things. The children's school schedules. A new project at his office. Traffic on the interstate. Then he grew quiet. He said Lauren felt that I had been distant lately. I listened without interrupting. Distant. It was an interesting word. I asked him whether declining one babysitting request qualified as distance. He shifted in his seat and admitted that perhaps it was more about a change in tone. I nodded slowly. Tone is often the first thing to change when boundaries begin to form. I told him I had been thinking carefully about my time and my role in their lives. I did not accuse. I did not recount the grocery store. I simply said that I wished to be treated as family, not as a default solution. He looked down at his coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. There was a softness in his expression that reminded me of the boy who once asked for help with math homework at the kitchen counter. But there was also hesitation, as if he feared acknowledging something would require action. He said he never meant for me to feel unappreciated. I believed him. Intention and impact are not always aligned. I asked him whether he thought it was appropriate for me to be introduced in ways that diminished my place in the family. He blinked, surprised. He asked what I meant. For a brief second I considered brushing it aside again. Instead, I met his eyes and said quietly that being reduced to a hired helper in a public setting had not gone unnoticed. His face flushed slightly. He said Lauren had been joking. I let the silence stretch between us long enough for the word to settle. Jokes reveal more than they conceal. I did not demand an apology. I did not raise my voice. I told him that respect is not a grand gesture. It is a consistent acknowledgment. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that statement. When he left later that afternoon, the pastry box was half empty, and the conversation remained unresolved but no longer avoided. I stood at the doorway as he walked to his car, noticing the way he paused before opening the driver's side door, as if considering turning back. He did not. That was all right. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It begins in small shifts of awareness. As I closed the door and returned to the quiet of my living room, I felt neither victorious nor defeated. I felt steady. The correction I had set in motion was no longer theoretical. It had been spoken calmly and clearly. And once words are placed in the open, they cannot be tucked away as easily as before. 2 days after Daniel's visit, Lauren called me directly. She did not text. She did not send a brief message through him. Her name appeared on my phone screen in clear letters, and for a moment I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered on the 4th tone. Her voice was smooth, carefully measured. She said Daniel mentioned that I felt disrespected recently, and that she wanted to clear the air. I listened without interrupting. She explained that the comment at the store had been harmless, that she had meant it playfully, that everyone knew she was joking. I pictured the fluorescent lights, the cashier's uncertain smile, my son's silence. I asked her gently whether she believed humor required someone else to be diminished. There was a pause, short but noticeable. She replied that I was being overly sensitive. I did not argue. I told her sensitivity is often the body's way of signaling truth. She exhaled, a soft sound that carried impatience more than remorse. She said she had always appreciated my help, and that perhaps I misunderstood the dynamic. Dynamic. Another interesting word. I thanked her for calling and said I hoped future introductions would reflect the reality of our relationship. She asked what I meant. I answered simply that I am Daniel's mother and her children's grandmother. Nothing more. Nothing less. The conversation ended politely, without resolution. Later that week, they invited me to dinner at their house. I accepted. Not out of obligation, but because avoidance does not correct imbalance. When I arrived, the table was set with more care than usual. Cloth napkins instead of paper. Candles lit though it was only Tuesday. Lauren greeted me at the door with a brief embrace. Daniel took my coat and hung it neatly in the hallway closet. The children ran toward me with uncomplicated joy, wrapping their small arms around my waist. Their affection remained untouched by adult tension. During dinner, conversation moved cautiously at first, as if we were stepping across thin ice. Daniel spoke about work. Lauren described a new yoga class she had joined. I listened, contributed where appropriate, and did not shrink. At one point, the youngest child asked whether I would come to her school presentation next month. Before I could answer, Lauren began to explain that they would check the calendar. I met her eyes calmly and said I would be honored to attend if the date worked for me. The distinction was subtle but deliberate. My schedule was no longer assumed to be empty, waiting. Midway through the meal, Daniel cleared his throat. He said he wanted to address something. He turned to me and then to Lauren. He admitted that the comment at the store had not been appropriate. The word appropriate carried more weight than joke ever had. Lauren's smile tightened slightly, but she nodded. She said she had not intended harm. I responded that intention is valuable, but impact is what lingers. The table fell quiet for a moment, not heavy, just honest. Then the children began talking about dessert, and the evening resumed its rhythm. When I left later that night, Daniel walked me to my car. He said he hoped we could move forward. I told him moving forward requires remembering what happened, not pretending it did not. As I drove home under the glow of streetlights, I noticed how steady my hands felt on the steering wheel. The correction was no longer invisible. It had been acknowledged, even if imperfectly. And sometimes acknowledgment is the first sign that balance is beginning to return. The following month unfolded without spectacle, which is how most meaningful change arrives. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices echoing through hallways. Instead, there were small, deliberate adjustments. When Daniel called to ask whether I could contribute to a home renovation they were considering, I requested time to review my own financial plans before answering. When Lauren invited me to join them at another store one Saturday morning, I agreed, but I arrived separately in my own car. These details may seem minor to someone watching from the outside. They were not minor to me. They were signals. At the school presentation my granddaughter had mentioned, I sat in the second row with a clear view of the stage. Lauren introduced me to another parent as Margaret, Daniel's mother. The phrasing was simple, accurate, unembellished. I noticed the effort in it. I acknowledged it with a nod, nothing more. Respect, when offered properly, does not require applause. It requires consistency. A week later, I returned to Mr. Henderson's office to finalize the updated trust documents. The language was precise. My assets would be distributed thoughtfully, with clear conditions that reflected mutual regard. My name would remain on the deed of Daniel's home, unless and until a formal agreement recognized my original investment. Nothing punitive. Nothing emotional. Simply structured fairness. I signed the paperwork with steady hands. As I drove home, I felt no triumph, only alignment. That evening Daniel stopped by again, this time without pastries or rehearsed gestures. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said he had been thinking about our conversation. He admitted that silence can feel easier in the moment, but it leaves a residue afterward. He said he did not want that residue between us. I listened. I told him that I was not asking for perfection. I was asking for acknowledgment. He nodded and, for the first time in years, reached across the table and squeezed my hand the way he used to when he was younger and unsure. The gesture was brief but genuine. A few days later I found myself once again in a grocery store, this time alone. I moved through the aisles at my own pace, selecting produce, reading labels, placing items into my cart without hurry. At the checkout counter, the cashier smiled and asked whether I had found everything I needed. I said yes. No explanations. No corrections required. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sun, I realized something that had taken me 72 years to articulate clearly. My role in anyone's life is not defined by how convenient I am. It is defined by how I allow myself to be treated. I cannot rewrite someone else's words once they are spoken, but I can decide which ones I carry forward. I am not a background character in my own family. I am not a placeholder, not a silent resource waiting to be tapped. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. I am Margaret Collins. And from this point forward, that name will stand on its own, steady and unqualified.